16:00 lördag den 20 november. Och mitt namn, för er som inte vet, är Anders Nordström, och jag är ordförande då i SMAD. Får hälsa er välkomna hit. Tänkte att vi var ganska kortfattade idag, så vi får börja provningen. Men det jag vill påminna om att nästa fredag så har vi ju en provning också med James A.D. buteljerare Rupert Patrick då, som håller i det. Det är en av grundarna då, eller grundaren av James A.D. Det finns platser kvar. Om ni inte har köpt platser på det, köp platser på det. Lika för er som vill att jag ska skicka whiskyn. Jag hinner fortfarande skicka, men jag skickar det på måndag om ni vill ha whisky. Annars så tänkte jag så vara kort. Provning 226. Ett relativt nytt distillery, Isle of Raasay, med Alistair Day. Så att Alistair, welcome to Borlänge and the tasting. The show is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and to Henrik and yourself for arranging it. It's really very interesting for me as well to talk to you all and tell you a little bit about the Isle of Raasay. So for those who don't know, the Isle of Raasay, very small island off the west coast of Scotland. It's just off the east coast of Skye. It's 14 miles long and 3 miles wide, so actually about the same size as Manhattan. However, Raasay only has, the last census, there were only 161 people that lived on Raasay. So slightly less people than Manhattan, but about the same size. So there's been a history of distilling on Raasay before, none of it legal. There are several sites on the island that if you visit, I could take you to where there's evidence of distilling, but very much not legal distilling. So there are some interesting stories, and that relations on Skye would hang out their whitewashing, and that signified that the customs officer was coming to Raasay, so the stills would disappear. In fact, I believe there's still one still in a bog up the north of Raasay that was never found. So we describe ourselves as the first legal distillery on the Isle of Raasay, and we wanted to make whiskey in Scotland maybe slightly differently. So definitely single malt, definitely Hebridean single malt, but perhaps with a different approach. It was a brand new distillery. We wanted to be honestly modern, and I'll just put a picture up so you can see what the distillery looks like behind me. So you can see it's a very modern building just behind me. They've got the original house, and then over here the visitor centre, and then this is the distillery itself just over here. So very new, and we wanted to have some different approaches to making our new make spirit, and I'll talk about some different elements that we do as we go through. But I think the best thing to do, so that I don't talk too much, is that we pour some whiskey and we start tasting the whiskey. So I believe the first one we're going to start with is the single cask bottling of the peated rye, which I have here. So I'm just going to pour some of that. This is a cask strength bottling. We have 6 different cask types. Well, 2 different spirits, unpeated and peated spirit, and 3 different types of wood. And the rye cask is one of those casks that forms part of our policy. So on our actual packaging, you'll always see reference to, I'm going to put this background off, otherwise it's going to disappear. We always make reference to the 6 casks, the three different oak casks. So if you can see, so that represents the cask. So 3 unpeated, 3 peated. First fill rye casks, predominantly from Woodford Reserve, and then Chinkapin oak casks, which are fresh casks, have not had any spirit in them before. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then the Bordeaux red wine casks. We have unpeated and peated in both. So that's why it's good to start with these bottlings. So this one, the reason we use rye casks, so very much like bourbon casks, Quercus alba casks, North American oak. So fairly typical, I would say, from that point of view in Scotch whisky. But the reason we use rye cask rather than bourbon cask is we want that black pepper spice note that you would get from rye whiskey that remains in the cask. And that's one of the elements we're trying to build in. Our new make spirit itself is quite sweet. So our fermentations are between 3 and 5 days, so up to 5-day fermentations. And we're doing these longer fermentations to try and build up a dark fruit character and almost a black currant note. So obviously cask strength, so about over 60%, about 62% this one I think. And you can see the colour fairly typical from a North American oak cask, and fairly typical again of something of this age, which is only just over 3 years old, so young whiskey. So on the palate, obviously, hint of sweetness to start with. You've got obviously the smoke from the peated. It's Highland peat that we use, so it's more kind of fragrant and aromatic. It's more of a wood smoke as compared to, say, Islay peat. There's a sweetness in there as well, and the sweetness, for me anyway, is balanced with that black pepper spice, as I say, from the rye. So, you know, got hopefully some complexity, some depth in there, and that's what we're aiming for. So, sweetness from the new make, some dark fruit from the new make, some black pepper spice, as I say, and then the smoke just layering across the top. But hopefully, even at cask strength, that's still quite approachable. I don't know if you usually open to questions, or if anyone wants to put anything in the chat. I'm happy to just answer anything as we go through, or any comments. But see, this is one of our pillars, one of our casks that makes up our single malt. And when we get onto the Arrow 1 later, then hopefully you'll start to see the characteristics of the first 2-3 casks that we go through. I'm just going to put a touch of water in mine, just because it changes slightly with the water. Also, while I'm doing that, sorry.
2 questions. All the whiskey you mature, is that matured on the full size bourbon cask, not as many young distilleries in Sweden that where we have 30 or 55 liters?
Yeah, so these are 190. These are American standard barrels, 190 liters. I've got some. I'll just stick a picture up. We've got a couple of different types of warehouses on Raasay. Bear with me just a second. I'll find that for you. So we have a dunnage warehouse, and we have a palletized warehouse. This is not working. Sorry. So so I should have said all of our spirit is matured on Raasay as well, and we do our own bottling on Raasay. So everything is not only distilled but matured and bottled on the island. Okay, my background's decided to not play, so apologies for that. Any other comments or thoughts on the rye cask or the spirit itself? Okay, well, what I might do is I'll put that to one side, and we'll maybe move on to the next cask if everyone's happy with that. I'm just going to have one more attempt at changing my background. No, it's not fine. So the next cask we have is again another cask from our recipe, from our wood policy, and this is the virgin Chickaben oak cask. So Chickaben oak, very interesting to me. My background actually is botany. I have a degree in botany, so I'm very interested in the different species of oak and how that can affect whiskey. So again, this is North American oak, but rather than being Quercus alba, it's Quercus muhlenbergi. And the common name for that is Chinkapin oak. So it grows in all the same parts of North America as Quercus alba, but it actually, for me anyway, is a much softer oak characteristic. Now, as I say, these casks, they're fresh casks, they've had nothing in them before. Our specification is that the oak is dried for 3 years, minimum of 36 months before the casks are made. And then when the casks are made, we use a high toast, so a highest level of toast, which helps caramelize the natural sugars in the wood. And then we do a very high char as well. So increases internal surface area, produces more charcoal in the cask. Now, obviously this is at similar age, it's our peated spirit, but you can see immediately the difference in the colour between the two spirits. And that's very much coming from the oak. And again, these are barrels, 190 litre cask, 190 litres in terms of the size, but you're getting a lot more, a much more active cask, and you get a lot more from the wood. So again, even though that's our same peated spirit in these casks, you can see just how different that is. Obviously, it doesn't have the spicy black pepper characteristic that the rye cask has, but what you do have is a lot more sort of richness and depth that you're getting from the Chinkapin oak. So the colour that you're getting, you're also getting that flavour from the cask as well. And I think that the peat, for me anyway, interacts differently from in this cask as well. So really quite a different style of so the maturation in the oak is giving a very different style of whiskey. And again, this is one of our core casks. So again, these are the elements. I think this develops more of that black fruit characteristic that I was talking about. So hopefully that's the case. So again, I'm happy to take any questions on that cask in a minute.
How did you find the Chinkapin cask? I think you must have been one of the first using it. It has become more popular, but I have seen it just as cask finishes.
Yes, so I think other distilleries have used it. So the likes of Jura, Arran, Glenalchie have all used it for cask finishing. What's interesting is that the wood itself has actually come from the wine industry in North America. So they were looking for different oak casks that would produce different flavors in the whiskey, and that's really it was really the North American wine producers that started using Chinkapin oak. And because before that, Quercus alba and Quercus Wildenbergi were always harvested together, were always felled together, and they weren't really separated. So I think a lot of bourbon casks probably do have quite a lot of Chinkapin oak in them, but it was the wine guys that really started separating that out and looking at flavour. So one of the things that we looked at when we were building the distillery in Raasay was looking at what other distillers had done around the world. So not just trying to produce a single malt Scotch whisky as had always been produced in Scotland, but taking influences from North America and Japan and looking at how, and in the craft distillers kind of revolution in the States with all of these, people making rye whiskey popular again and all these things. So they also looked to what the wine guys had done as well. So that's really where we picked up on the Chinkapin cask from. And also we worked quite closely with Henrik Mullen at Spirit of Venn. And when I was talking to Henrik Mullen about the different styles and the fact that we wanted this kind of dark fruit element, Henrik suggested that we looked at these Chinkapin casks. So that all these different influences outside Scotland, I think that's that's where we got these ideas from, and that's how we managed to develop that. I noticed someone in the chat's asking what parts per million our peated whisky is. So the barley that comes in, it's all Scottish barley, that comes in at between 50 and 52 parts per million in the barley itself. However, when we do our cuts, we take quite a narrow cut on the spirit. So in a single cask bottle like this, the parts per million in the bottle is in the region of 12, 13 parts per million. So we tend to talk about our single malt being lightly peated. So we're not trying to retain is all of that 55 parts per million. We're not taking a really wide cut and getting really into the heavy phenols, but we take a narrower cut for the style. It's more about the style of whiskey we're trying to produce. So the bottles that we try tonight, we can talk about that in individual levels, but for instance, the Arrow one would be about 6 parts per million. That's because we vatted unpeated and peated spirit together. With this, where it's actually bottled as a single cask bottling, it'll be about 12, around about 12 parts per million in the bottle. And the other thing as well is we've got a number of different things in the distillery that we can have offer on, and that's the flexibilities that I was talking about earlier. So we have our we have stainless steel washbacks, and they have cooling jackets on them. So when we do our longer fermentations, so say there's 70 to 120 hour fermentations, 3 to 5 days, we have the option to use the cooling jacket, so we can stop the temperature of the fermentation. So it doesn't control the temperature of fermentation, but what it actually does is puts cold water on the outside and it just stops fermentation. So what we tend to do when we're on our unpeated barley and we're doing the fermentations, we stop the temperature about 32 parts per million. When we're using peated barley and we're doing those fermentations, we let the temperature go much higher and it'll go up to 34, 35. And what that does, we think, is it allows more development of fusel oils, some of the heavier compounds, the oily mouthfeel characteristics in the actual wash itself, just by controlling the temperature slightly. So, you know, if we were comparing our unpeated and our peated, our peated spirit would actually be more viscous, slightly heavier and slightly oilier as well. So I think some of that characteristics comes from the way that we run our fermentations, and we can control the temperature slightly in the fermentation. And then on the wash still, on the line arm, we have a cooling jacket on the line arm, so before it goes to the condenser. And just after the cooling jacket, we have a collection pot. And what we do is that we take the spirit that condenses early back down into the wash still, so we form a loop. And again, we tend to have that cooling jacket off when we're on unpeated, but we have it on when we're unpeated. And what happens is that the heavier vapors condense earlier and go back down into still. So we build up a loop and we build up more of these heavier, slightly oilier compounds. And again, that helps with our trying to get our more viscosity and oiliness into our peated spirit. So again, as I was saying, when we designed this, we want to have these things that would be offer on, and that allows us to produce, you know, although it's unpeated and peated, they are different characteristics and different mouthfeels to the peated spirit as well. So we were able to build that into the design, and you know, that's the luxury of being a new distillery, is that we started with a blank sheet of paper, and we designed a single malt distillery that met all of the Scotch whisky regulations, but then allowed us to produce different styles. So with the unpeated and the peated, and then with the different things being offered on, we can produce maybe 5 or 6 different styles of new make. And on the spirit still, just after the line arm and the spirit still, just before it gets to the condensers, there are 2 valves. So we can divert the vapor from the spirit still to a little purifier. So instead of going directly to the condenser, it goes to the purifier. The purifier has 6 copper plates, the little bubble cap plates. And if you imagine you took that and you put it on top of the still, it would be a Carter head still. So we can change the shape of our still just by opening a valve. So we can go from a swan neck still to a Carter head still. And what that does is it just, if you like, it just cleans it up, it polishes it, and it focuses it on that black currant note. So although you get a lighter spirit, you get a more intense dark fruit flavour from it. So again, just some different things that we can do in the distillery that create different styles of spirit. So hopefully, again, when we get onto the single malts that we've vatted all of these different spirits together, you'll see hopefully the complexity and depth that we're trying to create in what is, you know, a young whiskey. And we set out knowing that we were going to make young whiskey, but knowing that it had to be good. And then we were like, well, how do you ensure that you know what is good? And for me, good is complexity, depth, and balance. And that's what we're trying to achieve with the way we make the spirit, but also the different oak casts that we use as well. And this is probably a good time to move on to the next whiskey, because it's again another single cask bottling. This time our peated spirit, but in Bordeaux red wine casks. So again, you can see the difference in the colour. It's got more of a kind of autumnal gold, I'll call it, a kind of coppery blush colour to it. So wine casks, Bordeaux wine casks, they can be divisive in terms of some people like them and some people don't like wine casks, and everyone has a different opinion. But again, we're not using these for finishing. We're using, in this case anyway, we're using it for full term maturation. So yes, initially when the spirit goes in, you do get the influence of the red wine, and you can smell the dark fruits and the black grapes that come from the wine. However, what happens is that the spirit goes much further into the wood than the wine does. So the wine cask, we work with a number of different chateaus. We use Chateau Calscure, Chateau Parma, Chateau Margaux, so all left bank Bordeaux wines, which tend to be higher in tannins. And again, that's what we're looking for. We want more of those tannin forward, more of those kind of, as I keep going back to the dark fruit flavors that we're trying to build up. But the spirit in time goes past that. So after 3 months, it's blush pink. After 6 months, it's kind of going more of a darker red color. By the time you've got to 12, 18 months, it's actually starting to lose that red, and you're getting much more into this kind of dark, more brown colors that are coming, say, sort of a rusty red or a autumnal brown. And then by that point, after 18 months, 24 months, the spirit's actually getting into the French oak. Now, we actually inherit the tonneliers that make the cooperages that make the casks for the chateaus have their own recipe, and they use in France, they don't really talk about the species, they talk about the area that the oak comes from. They talk about, there's Allier, which is the forest that, or Limousin is another forest that they get the oak from. But for me, what's really interesting is the tonneliers use different amounts of Quercus petrea and Quercus roba. Now, although these are both French oak, they're both European oaks, the Quercus petrea is very tight grained, is very narrow grained, and the Quercus roba is more open. So the proportions we have of the different roba and petrea affects the characteristic of particularly the spirit, and affects the wine, but particularly the spirit as well. And we've got some casks on Raasay that are actually fresh casks, and never had any spirit in, and they're 100% Quercus petrea, and others are 100% roba, and you really get the different characteristics. So the petrea gives you much more of a kind of bitter orange marmalade note, and the roba gives you much more of the classic savoury spices like clove and cinnamon and these elements. So what we're hoping to get in this cask, again, obviously it's a peated spirit, so you have the smoke. The smoke in this, to me, is more muted. You get a little bit more of a jammy note, almost a raspberry jam note that's going on there, but then the smoke comes in, and you don't really start getting that kind of savoury spice until the finish and on the palate. And I'm just going to again put a touch of water in this, so you can see how that changes as well. So these 3 single cask bottlings are of great interest to me, because it's actually showing the fact that you can take the same spirit and put it into mature different casks, and you've got the different influences. So 3 very different single malts, but it's really the characteristics of the casks that are coming through. And the reason that's important to me is that these are the casks that we use to produce the 6 cask recipe that we talk about, that we then back together to make the single malt. So that is the complexity and depth I was talking about. And as I say, we knew we were going to bottle a young whiskey at 3, 4, 5 years old. We knew we had to have complexity and depth. So the other thing that we also knew is you can't change the aging process. The aging process of spirit and oak takes time. You can't change that, it takes time. And it takes a long time for those lignins, those oak molecules, to break down into smaller molecules that then turn into the flavour compounds in the whiskey. So we're not trying to change that, but what I think we can do is that we can introduce different flavours by either changing things in the distillery and making slightly different types of new make, or by using different casks. And then the difficulty is, or the trick is, to once you've got the complexity and depth, you need to create the balance between these 3 different cask types. So hopefully, as you can see, these are very different. The rye is very different from the wine, and the Chinkapin oak is very different from the other 2. So the trick then is, when we get on to tasting the single malt, is I'll talk you through how we put these 6 different elements together, and hopefully how we create balance in them. But before that, just if there's any questions on any of these 3 single cask bottlings, I'm more than happy to answer them. Hopefully as well, you can see that the oak species itself makes a huge difference. So the first whisky we had, Quercus alba, second whisky, Quercus muhlenbergiana, and the third whisky we had, Quercus petrea and Quercus roba. So you've got 4 different species of oak there, in 3 different bottlings. And obviously, clearly the previous contents of the casks make a big difference, and that's where the rye and the wine add into that as well.
I was a little surprised. I felt that in glass number 2, the Chinkapin, the peat was not so dominant or coming forward as much as in the other 2. It seems like the wood is hiding the peatiness, or the Chinkapin oak is hiding the peatiness.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. The Chinkapin casks it's a very active cask. It's not had any content in it before, so yes, you get much more influence from the oak. However, I think as well with the flavours, you get more of a kind of barbecued spare rib. Dave Broom described it as an American diner. You get these kind of like syrup pancakes with smoked bacon bits on the top, and I think that's how the smoke interacts differently with the oak. But I think you're right; it's not as forward as, for me, it's more forward in the rye and less so in the wine, and then even less so in the oak. But no, I think that's a very important point, and the fact that we are also taking a narrow cut means that we're not really promoting. We're not trying to get into your larger, heavier phenol compounds. That's not what our whiskey's about, and that's really, when we talk about lightly peated, what we mean. But no, I think you're absolutely correct in what you say about the influence of the Chinkapin cask on the peat. Definitely. Okay. Well, the next whiskey that I was going to go to was our inaugural release, and just before I open the inaugural release, I'll talk a little bit about our inaugural release and why it's different from our actual single malt going forward. So, some of you may know that in R&B Distillers, the company that owns Isle of Raasay Distillery, Bill and I founded that company in 2014, specifically to build the Isle of Raasay Distillery. And in 2015, we decided to create a whiskey called Raasay while we wait. Now, clearly we hadn't built the distillery, we didn't have our own spirit, but we worked with another Highland distillery to produce a single malt that would maybe give an idea of what our Raasay whiskey would taste like, and allow us to talk about building the distillery and the whiskey. Now, While We Wait was unpeated single malt and peated single malt matured separately that we then vatted together. And the distillery working didn't have a dark fruit character in their spirit. So we used unpeated and peated, we vatted that together to get lightly peated, and then we finished it in Tuscan red wine casks. And why Tuscan red wine casks? Our stills were made by Philly in Italy. And when I went to see the stills being made, I was fortunate enough to go to a vineyard that made super Tuscan wine. And I was talking to the owner, and he said, well, I use the cask for 3 vintages and then I get rid of them. And I thought, would you give the cask to us? So he agreed to do that. So while we wait, we finished in Means Tuscan red wine cask. And then a lot of people asked, while we're building the distillery, how do you know that your single malt is going to taste like this? I said, well, we've designed it, as I've said so far, to produce these different spirit types to make a lightly peated single malt with dark fruit characteristics. And really that's what While We Wait is. So as part of that, I wanted our first whiskey from Raasay to reflect, to be the link between While We Wait and our future single malt. So we used bourbon casks. They were actually from Jack Daniel's, so Tennessee whiskey casks. We matured the spirit in those casks for 2 years, and then we took them out of those casks and matured it for a further year in the Bordeaux red wine cask. So the inaugural release is very much the link between While We Wait and our single malt. So I have a bottle here. So this was bottled a year ago, November 2020. It's the first time that we used our Isle of Raasay bottle. So just a little bit about the bottle itself before I go on to the whiskey. So we talk a lot about our water on the island. So we have a well on site, and that water we use all the way through the process. We use it for mashing, we use it for fermentation, we use it for the cask reduction, we use it for bottling, we use it for the cooling as well. And so Raasay, as you can see the little map behind me, is very complex geology. And we talk about the geology a lot as well. And the reason we talk about the geology is that's how the geology of the island affects the water of the island, and that therefore affects our whiskey. So there's a lot of volcanic rock on the island, and the highest point, Duncan, is basalt, and then around us is granite. But where the distillery is really old sandstone, Jurassic sandstone. So it's very porous. It's like a big sponge. So again, we're very fortunate that the water, the rain, and it rains a lot in Raasay, over hundreds of years, runs off the volcanic rock, which is impervious, picks up all these volcanic minerals, and then ends up below the distillery in the Jurassic sandstone. So we draw that up, and it affects the whiskey in a number of different ways. One of the minerals is manganese, which is really important for the development of yeast. So the manganese helps our yeast development and therefore our fermentation. The water is also slightly hard as well, which is unusual in Scotland. Most distilleries have soft water. We have slightly hard water, and the hardness is beneficial in that it helps us develop more sweeter characteristics in our new make. So hard water tends to give slightly sweeter whiskey. One of the reasons that we do longer fermentations is that the yeast development, so you get all of the alcohol in 48 hours. After 72 hours, the yeast is starting to die off. And by the time you get to 5 days, the yeast has died off, but we think we start to get lactobacillus development. So lactobacillus comes in naturally on the barley. There's a lot of different types of lactobacillus, but only 2 or 3 of them can survive the temperatures of mashing. And those lactobacillus actually develop lactic acid, which increases the acidity again. So we have the acidity that you need for the interaction with the copper, but also the acidity, the lactic acid reacts with the esters and forms more of the flavour compounds that then distill over. So it's a lot of conversation about the geology and the water, but we wanted to reflect that in the bottle. So as you can see, when you look at the bottle, we have the fossil in the glass here. But the texture actually comes from the designer sent us modelling clay, and we pushed the modelling clay into the rocks on Raasay. And then from the clay, they used that to make the mould for the bottle. So the glass literally is like holding a piece of the island. It is the rocks on the island and the fossils from the island. And hopefully it helps give you some idea of what Raasay's like, a rugged, windswept island, but also starts allowing us to talk about the geology and the water itself. So just going to pour some of the inaugural release. This was bottled at 52%. And as I say, you can see from the colour, you've just got that little bit of influence of the wine cask that we use for a year. And again, this is about, as I say, is about 12 parts per million in the glass. You see it's quite different from the previous three bottles. The peat probably is more forward. There's more of a sweetness to it as well. More of that dark fruit characteristic that I was talking about as well. So just a different approach, but as I say, it was the inaugural release was a one-off. There was, I think, 9,000 bottles in the end. We sold it all online before, so it sold out in the September, and we actually batted and bottled it in the November last year. Again, happy to take any questions or hear what anybody thinks, how different this is to the single cask bottlings that we do. So I think you can see the difference in the character from that. I think the influence from the oak in each of the single cask bottling gives wider difference than this particular release that we done. We've done something slightly similar. So the last whiskey we're going to taste tonight is made in a similar way to this, but again, it's quite different. So I'll talk more about that when we get to the last whiskey. So might be a good time to move on to our R01, so our single malt proper. So this was bottled in May this year. So this is the first time that we put the 6 different casks together. So you had the unpeated spirit matured in the rye cask, the Chinkapin cask, and the Bordeaux red wine cask, and then you had the peated spirit matured in the rye cask, the Chinkapin old cask, and the red wine cask. So 2 different types of spirit matured in 3 different cask types, completely separately, and then vatted together. So the vatting process takes a while. It takes us a while to disgorge the cask, but we also then leave it in the vatting tank for at least a week, and we recirculate that tank at cask strength. The reason we do that is it takes a long time for all these different cask types to marry together, and then we slowly add water, about 200 litres at a time. So it takes us at least another week to reduce it down to bottling strength. And the bottling strength for this whiskey, the R01, was 46.4. So again, you can see the colour slightly lighter than certainly the rye and the Chinkapin cask. But hopefully you'll see what we're trying to achieve, and that we're trying to get that complexity and depth that we're looking for in a young whiskey. So just to talk a little bit about the proportions of the rye cask, the Chinkapin and the Bordeaux, we use predominantly the rye cask. The rye cask is our base. And then the next cask that we use in terms of quantity is the Chinkapin cask. And the red wine cask is the smallest amount. So the red wine casks are there just for the top notes, just to float that dark fruit flavour across the top. Again, the peat levels in this is quite light because we're marrying unpeated and peated. This is about 6 parts per million in the bottle. You get that kind of dark fruit sweetness at the start. The peat takes a while to develop through that, but you're still getting that richness of the Chinkapin oak casks in the middle. And then just a little hint of the of the spiciness and the black pepper from the rye cask, but hopefully all marrying together to give layers. And each time you go back to the glass, there are slightly different elements. There's some butterscotch notes in there, maybe hints of vanilla from the Quercus alba. Some of the savoury spice as well, just coming through from the French oak. And in terms of the legs on the glass, you've seen some oiliness, predominantly coming from the peated cask, the peated spirit. The legs are running fairly slowly there as well. The slight oiliness on the palate as well.
Alistair, can you please explain a bit about the naming of the whiskey R01 and the idea behind it?
Yeah, so it's actually very simple. Our plan is to produce 2 batches a year. So the R01 is just batch 1 of 2021, and then we produced a second batch of our single malt, our signature single malt this year, which was R02. So exactly the same casks, but in that vatting, we actually use slightly more of the peated casks. So the difference between R01 and R02 is just that there's slightly more peated casks used in R02. But the intention is, as we go forward into next year, there'll be 2 bottlings of the single malt next year, which will be R01.1 and R02.1. So the R01 is just the first vatting, the first batch of each year. And the 0.1 is just so that when you sit down and if you have other batches in the future that you've bought and you want to compare them, it's very easy to see what the differences are. So 2 batches a year, and then the point just literally tells you which year. So say next year will be R01.1 and R02.1 for next year. So what it allows us to do is we've got this 6 cask recipe. The 6 cask recipes there to give us complexity and depth. The vatting hopefully gives us the balance. But then what it allows us to do is we can vary the proportions of each of the casks. Because we are a small distillery, we are going to always produce our whiskey in batches. It's just the nature of our size. So where we want to have continuity, we want to have continuity between 2 lines. So we set our parameters, we try and keep it within those parameters all the time. But the very fact that it's batch means that there will be variations in the batch. So the R01 and the R02 and then the points are just so that it's readily identifiable in the future as to which particular batch it is. And we're always hopefully transparent, and we'll tell you on the website, it tells you what the differences between the batches are and why. And then it would be great to meet again and do another tasting and we can discuss what those variations have mean. But hopefully we want everyone to be able to pick up a bottle of Island Raasay single malt and always know that they're going to get the Island Raasay single malt and what that's going to taste like. But then when you put them together and you taste them together, then hopefully we'll then be able to see the differences and talk about why there are differences within that parameter that we're looking to produce. Hopefully, Peter, that answers the question. Okay, on that note, it'd be probably pretty good to go and try R02. So we can try R01 and R02 together. So exactly the same recipe, unpeated and peated put together, but more of the peated cask. So there's still the 6 casks, there's still the rye cask, the chicken oak cask, and the red wine cask. But what we've done, we've just increased the amount of the peated spirit. So again, for me, this is really interesting because, you know, on the face of it, you would expect the peat to be more prevalent. So here's. I think there's slightly darker colour to this one. The other thing that I should say as well is there's slightly older casks in this, just because of the, if you like, the 6 months between the 2 vattings. We had still had some casks from 2017. So there's there's some casks that are closer to 4 years old, whereas in R01, everything was just over the 3-year-old mark. So I think you get a little bit more from the age rather than the peat. So even though that there are more peated casks, quite significantly more peated casks in this, you don't necessarily get that straight away. It's how that peat, it's like we were talking about earlier about how the chinkapin and the peat work together very differently. I think it's not as simple as just you increase the peated, it's how those casks work together. So I actually, for me anyway, there's slightly less peat on the palate of this than there is in R01, even though I know that we've used more peated than that. But I think what it brings more depth. I think there's more, use the word richness. There's maybe a little bit more complexity to the R02 than the R01. And you know, I'm really genuinely interested to hear what everyone thinks of the difference too. So it's the same recipe, just slightly different cask proportion.
Well, I can totally agree that the R02 has a little bit more character than R01, so that's very obvious. Yeah,
it's fascinating as well. It's just literally just a few tweaks in the quantity of the cask, but you definitely get a little bit, I think, a bit more complexity in the R02. Yeah. Great to hear. Be interested if anyone disagrees with that, anyone thinks that there's more in R01.
I'm just going to jump in here for a commercial note. As you may have noticed on the Systembolaget website, the R02 is called Raasay single malt, and that is actually for the very reason of the commercial structure of Systembolaget. If we were to call it R02, we would unfortunately be delisted when the next batch, R02.1, would be finished. And as anticipated, we have achieved 2 local store listings in Skåne, which we anticipated in record time, actually in 3 weeks, which we are very grateful for. So if we would have called it R02 on the website, we would have to start all over when the next batch is finished. So that's why it is called only single malt at this period of time. And when the R01 is going to be released later in 2022, we have to find a way how to call it on the website to avoid a scenario where we are being jumped out of shelves in stores. So in case any one of you participants are wondering why it's called only single malt, that is the actual reason. It's the Systembolaget setup.
And I think, Peter, as well, from our point of view on Isle of Raasay, is that we want R1, R2, whatever those batch numbers are, we want it to be Isle of Raasay single malt. You know, we want everyone to know that when they go and buy Isle of Raasay single malt, it will always be similar. And you know, the difference between R01 and R02 that we've tasted just now are they're small variations, but I think it'll always be Isle of Raasay single malt. But at the same time, I completely understand that everyone will want to be able to identify which batch it is as well. So it's important for us to have both, but very much, I think, a good thing to talk about Isle of Raasay single malt. And then the other single bottlings are exactly that, single cask bottlings or the special release that we'll taste next are very much different from the actual single malt itself. But yeah, no, good point. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the 6 cask recipe and the different unpeated and peated spirit that we make and the effect of the wood. One of the other things that we were asked and have been asked several times is, you know, why we don't use bourbon and why we don't use sherry casks. Well, it's very much about our recipe and the style of whiskey that we want to produce, but we recognise obviously that that sherry cask are very popular. A lot of people that like sherry. So to address that, we started working in a way that we could produce a special release, limited amount of bottles that were still Isle of Raasay single malt, but used sherry casks in a way that would work with our spirit and with our ideology of how we make Isle of Raasay whiskey. So what we decided to do is we matured our peated spirit in the rye cask. So the rye casks, as I've said already, are the base. That's the most casks that we've got in the warehouses on Raasay. So we used that. We took some of those casks. After about 28 months, we took them out of those casks. So, yeah, about 28 months, we took them out of those casks. We vatted those casks together, and then we put them back into quarter casks. So 125 litre casks that were that had been used for Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez. So predominantly Oloroso, but a small amount of Pedro Jimenez. And they were in those quarter casks for 9 months. So 9 months, is a long finish anyway, but in quarter casks there's even more of the flavour. So the last whiskey that we have this evening is our special release, which we are currently selling directly from our website here in the UK. So I apologise for that at the moment, but I'm sure in the future we'll be able to talk to people and come up with some solutions for Sweden. So this, again, you can see the colour, very much more of like the Chinkopin oak in terms of the colour. You do get, again, you do get the spiciness from the rye cask in this, but hopefully we've got the balance between the Oloroso and the Pedro Jimenez. So the Oloroso, dry, nutty sherry, and the Pedro Jimenez, sweet with dried fruit flavour. So we're trying to balance the pepperiness of the rye cask with the dry nuttiness of the Oloroso, and then the sweetness and the dried fruits from the Pedro Jimenez. Again, very different to any of the other whiskies we've had so far, and much more of the sherry influence at the end, but hopefully a small amount of peat in there. This again is about 11 parts per million, so it's still lightly peated, but I think you're getting so many different flavours going on there, and our job here is hopefully to balance those flavours together. And I think as well, the reason we're doing this special release at this time of year, this is much more, if you like, the classic seasonal flavours going on. So you do have those kind of cinnamon, spicy notes in there with the sweetness of the sherry as well. So again, really, really interested to hear what everyone thinks of that. We've done, so we use, when I talk about the 6 cask recipe so far, about 80% of everything that we fill on Raasay is the unpeated and peated in the 3 different cask types. But we have 20% of what we fill in different casks, and that ranges from sherry, tawny port, marsala, and some of the fresh Patria and Roa casks that we talked about. We also have an interesting cask from South America, an oak species called Quercus humboldti, which actually come from the Andes Mountains. They grow about 3,000 feet up, and the casks that we've had were made for us in Colombia. So there's a number of different things that we continue to work on in the background. The reason for that is that we want to establish the recipe, the single malt, so that everyone hopefully knows what Raasay single malt is and how we put that together. But for the future, we have a smaller amount of casks that hopefully over the years we can develop into these special releases. I feel like I've talked an awful lot this evening, and if there are any questions, please ask, or ask Peter or Henrik, and I'll certainly answer them by email in the future if needs me.
Alistair, what would you say are the biggest differences between R01 and R02 in your opinion?
I think the biggest difference is the amount of peated that we used in R02. So the balance between unpeated and peated in the two is the, if you like, the physical biggest difference. However, I think I was saying when we were tasting it that it's not as simple as that. Whiskey is not a linear. It's not a linear thing. It's all about getting the balance of flavors. And I think for me, having some slightly older casks in there as well just helps the complexity. And that's something that we are very conscious of. We're looking at our bottling for 2022 and we're looking at a bottle for 2023. We're conscious by the time we get to 2023 that we'll have the impact of COVID, because we produced a lot less whiskey in 2020 because we stopped distilling for a period of time. So, we're working very hard to look at our stock and look at the cask and look at the recipe and maintain that certainly through the next 2-3 years going forward. So, hopefully we'll keep developing the complex elements that you find in R02. So I would, in simple terms, is that there's slightly more complexity to R02 than there is R01, but it's not as straightforward as it being more peated, even though there is more peated spirit in that. So I think that's why it's certainly fascinating to us to work with a recipe. I think we can produce a more complex whiskey with more depth, the way that we do it with these 6 different casks. And that's why it's very exciting for me to be able to put the recipe together and be looking at next year's recipes as well. And I think hopefully you'll see that develop through next year as well with us. So I know that's maybe a bit of a vague answer of the difference between R1 and R2, but I think it isn't. It's easy to say we use more peated cask, but that doesn't tell you the full story when you taste the whiskey. So I think it is about what we're striving to do is to create complexity, depth, and balance. And as long as we're doing that, then I'm doing what I set out to achieve with our wood policy and the spirit that we're distilling on that.
Okay, any more questions to Alistair?
I want to ask, did I get it right that you were very interested in the botanical things, or that you had worked with that before, or? Yeah,
so I studied botany at Glasgow University, so my degree's in botany. So that means that I'm very interested in things like the oak species and how that affects. So I do focus on that a lot, as you can probably tell from this evening, but it also meant I was very keen to go Raasay, to go barley on Raasay. So before we had even built the distillery in 2017, we had harvested our first barley grown on Raasay. Now, Raasay doesn't have any infrastructure for arable agriculture at all. The closest fields to Raasay where barley is grown commercially is Dingwall, and if you know Scotland, that's quite a long way over on the east. So it started off as a trial in 2017 to grow barley on Raasay. Now, Raasay is really too wet for commercial varieties to ripen, so we had to find some other varieties that would grow on Raasay. So we put some concerto in, the commercial variety, as a control, so that we could actually see how that grew. We grew bear. Now bear are obviously Bruichladdich do bear every year. Aaron's growing some bear. Bear is an ancient landrace. It's been in the Western Isles of Scotland for over 2,500 years. It started off 20,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, and slowly worked its way over to Europe, and then eventually to the north of Scotland. And needless to say, it grew very well on Raasay, and it looked like it was meant to be. it is a 6-row barley, and it doesn't yield a lot of barley from the field, and it doesn't yield a lot of alcohol. So we put a couple of other varieties in, Iskria, which is a 2-row from Iceland, and Canas, which is actually from Norway. So Scandinavian varieties, both of which are grown successfully inside the Arctic Circle. So we're not as cold as that, but we are wet, which means our growing season, we only have from May to August to plant and grow and ripen barley. So again, you're getting a very raw answer, but yes, I'm very interested in the botanical side of, and before, so my great grandfather was a whiskey blender, and that original business that he ended up owning started in 1820. So I have this kind of whiskey heritage, and I inherited his cellar book. It's got all the recipes for all the blends that the company produced from 1899 to 1916. So I'm fascinated by that because it's my heritage as well. But I also worked in the dairy industry. So cheese is very interesting as well because it's fermented and it's matured. But the lactobacillus element of that's fascinating for me because the lactobacillus in dairy is really, really important. And in Scottish cheddar, we were trying to develop the flavour profile in the cheese at an earlier age. So there was one particular lactobacillus that allowed us to do that. And what's fascinating for me is that's actually one of the lactobacillus that can survive the temperatures in mashing as well. So we haven't identified it yet on Raasay, but I'm certainly going to have a good look. But yeah, so I'm very interested in those elements, and without taking us down any dead end roads. But it's very, very interesting to approach, hopefully approach making whiskey from a different perspective.
How would the local barley then affect the taste in the whiskey?
It's very different. We have distilled 3 years of Raasay barley now. But I have to say, very, very small quantities. So we only have 3 casks from each year, from 2017, 2018, 2019. Very small amounts. But if you're ever on Raasay and I'm there and I'm in the warehouse, I'll let you try. You can taste it. You definitely can taste how different the Raasay barley is. And some of that is the varieties, obviously, but some of that is because it grew on Raasay. And also in the very first year, we used some Raasay peat as well to malt the barley. So in the future, these are going to be very special releases that they're probably going to be very expensive because it was very expensive to make, but it is very interesting. And we've also grown some barley on Orkney, a variety called Saloma, and we've grown some barley in Campbelltown as well. So and some barley in the Scottish borders. So hopefully over the years, not just have the Raasay barley, but the intention is to make this spirit from these barleys from the different regions and mature it separately as well. So, you know, we may see in the future the difference between Orkney and Campbelltown barleys, which would be interesting. So these are all small amounts. It's not a core single malt, but I think without using a certain word beginning with T, I think it's fascinating the provenance of the barley and how that can affect, as well as I think maturing everything on Raasay and bottling and everything on Raasay is really important as well. We don't tanker our spirit off to the mainland and mature it there. We do it all on Raasay, and I think we've had discussions about whether or not the climate in Raasay will affect the maturation of wheat, and it's too early to say whether it will or not. But it'll certainly be interesting to see as time progresses.
I think that was a quite good show of your whiskey, but in this case, it's still very young. So, do you have a aim to have older whiskey, or do you look for like 8 to 10, or where would you, when time comes, where will you probably land in your? Where will the other Raasay be, to say?
Yeah, very good point, very interesting. So one of the benefits of the recipe is that we're emptying casks and refilling casks. So particularly the Chinkerman pass have never nothing in them before, so when we refill them, they're effectively first fill casks. So that's part of what we're doing with the recipe as well. So all of the casks that we're using in the recipe, first fill rye casks, first fill red wine, Bordeaux red wine casks, these casks will be refilled and will form part of the recipe. So for your 8, 9, 10-year-old, we'll be using much more of the refill casks for the older whiskey. So we have intentionally thought about that. And when we did our business plan for Raasay, we said that we wanted to produce 200,000 litres of pure alcohol a year. That if you bottled all of that, it would be 6,000 bottles. So we've said in principle to get to at some point selling 300,000 bottles from Raasay a year at 3, 4, 5 years old, but always having half of that stock laid down to get to 8, 9, 10 years old. So it's early to say, but our intention is to have 10-year-old whiskey. It might be in 8 years' time, but the intention is to have that.
Thank you.
And hopefully our wood policy and our recipe means that we still have the complexity and depth at 10 years old.
Okay. I'm going to introduce Peter Haverkorn from North Beverages, who is the importer to Sweden. Do you want to say something to us from you?
Yes, absolutely. You want me to take it in English or Swedish?
Depends on Alistair if he has to hear
Swedish is fine for me. You just have to tell me afterwards what you said.
All right. I'll update you afterwards. Peter Haverkorn heter jag. Driver Northern Beverages som är stolt distributör av Isle of Raasay i Sverige och även Finland. Startade bolaget för 3 år sedan, har en bakgrund i branschen sedan 2000, bland annat jobbat för Edrington med varumärken som Macallan och Highland Park, Famous Grouse som vi alla känner till. Och av en slump ramlade jag på Isle of Raasay och följde med deras resa här. Från det att de bara hade While We Wait till Inaugural som kom för ett år sedan på Systembolaget och var en fullständig succé. Otroligt roligt att jobba med det här destilleriet, för det känns verkligen som ett familjeföretag man jobbar med. Mycket hjärta och smärta och vi har väldigt tät dialog och relation på det sättet. Ser fram emot när den här virusperioden är över så man kan komma och hälsa på. Whiskyn är ju, tycker jag, för att vara så ung är den ju helt outstanding. Fantastisk whisky. Vi släppte ju single cask här i höstas som har gått jättebra. Fortfarande finns det några rye och red wine Bordeaux kvar på Systembolaget att köpa för den som är intresserad. R02 släpptes i mitten av oktober efter en massa Brexit-strul som inte var av denna värld. Jag fick mina första gråa hårstrån på grund av det, tror jag. Och jag har glädjen att meddela att vi har nu 2 butiker som nu har R02 på hyllorna. Jätteroligt, och vi försöker att behålla dem tills nästa batch av R02 är klar i maj. En utmaning. Idén med Northern Beverages, kanske ni undrar, det är att förse er konsumenter med produkter, högkvalitativa produkter som har en historia och mer än bara en bra vätska. Och här tycker jag att Raasay verkligen passar in med sin fatkomposition. Vi har Alastairs bakgrund som botanist och en ny ö som dessutom ett nytt ursprung till whiskyvärlden. Superkul att jobba med dem, och jag är oerhört tacksam för att så många vill vara med på den här provningen med vår whisky. Ja, lite så helt enkelt.
Spännande att höra. Någon mer som har några frågor till antingen Peter eller till Alistair? Eller ska vi rösta på kvällens bästa whisky? Vi röstar då. Nu gör vi så att vi lägger ut en poll då, där ni röstar, och ni som är då 2 eller 3 på era rum, ni får köra i chatten då. Det här kommer också innebära att det tar lite längre tid för mig att prata eller göra ordning vem som har vunnit, men då får ni chattra på om annat. Vi kör poll på en gång.
Alistair, I come back again.
Hello.
Okay, a private question. Are you from Raasay?
I'm not from Raasay, no. We have 25 people that work at the distillery, and 20 of those people are all from Isle of Raasay.
Okay, but how did it come that you did go to Raasay or start a distillery at Raasay?
Yeah. So
it must be the smallest island in Scotland with a distillery, as I can understand. Smaller than Jura.
Yeah, smaller than Jura, yeah. It's smaller than Jura. So yes, it probably is. There are some other islands with gin distilleries, but I think we're the smallest single malt distillery. Yeah. So as I said, my connection with whiskey is my great-grandfather, Richard D. He was a whiskey blender, but in Coldstream, in the Scottish borders, so the complete opposite end of Scotland from Raasay. And I, in 2009, decided to recreate one of his blended whiskies called the Tweedale. So that's how I started working in whiskey. And by 2012, it was really, really difficult to be able to buy mature casks of whiskey. It was about the same time that Macallan took their age statement off. It was really, really difficult to get aged whiskey. So I wrote a business plan to raise investment. Initially, I thought to buy casks, and then when I realised how much money I needed to buy casks for the future, I realised I could build a small distillery. So I wrote a business plan to build a small distillery, and it's a very long story, but I met I met Bill, my business partner, who's the investor, who is the sole investor in Isle of Raasay Distillery. And when I met Bill, he said, well, I'm thinking about building a distillery, but on the Isle of Raasay. And I said, well, why Raasay? And his oldest friend from school, who's called Ian Hector Ross. Ian Hector Ross's wife, Marion's family's from Raasay. And so Bill said, you should come up and have a look. There's a disused hotel for sale. So I went up with Bill and I stood outside the hotel and I looked at the views of Skye and looked around the island and thought, this is absolutely the place to build a distillery. And so we didn't look back. So hence the Isle of Raasay Distillery.
Do you live on the island or somewhere else in Scotland?
I live in just outside Edinburgh, but I spend most weeks on Raasay. So I always say it's a 5-hour commute. So 5-hour drive, a ferry, and I'm there.
Alistair, are you able to reveal a bit on the special edition you're planning for 2023?
Yeah, so 2023 is very much the same basis as what we've tasted this evening as whiskey number 7. So we have put some rye casks aside. It's our intention in January to vat those and put them into Oloroso and BX quarter cask. So it'll be very, very similar to what we've done this year, which is very handy just seeing that whole.
If we go to the island, are there anything else to look at beside the distillery and the fossils?
Yeah, so number of things. Firstly, at the distillery we have 6 ensuite bedrooms, so you can come and stay with us at the distillery. Our neighbour Raasay House, they have slightly more bedrooms. They have 28 bedrooms, and they run as a hotel. They also run an outdoor centre, so there's canoeing and archery and rock climbing and electric bicycles and all sorts of interesting things. And they have a rib, and they go on rib tours. And this year they saw some minke whale and porpoise and white-tailed sea eagles, and so there's very good trips. Also, the walk up Duncan, it's not very high, but when you stand on the top, you have 360 degrees, so you can see all of Skye, you can see Applecross, you can see out to the Outer Hebrides. On a good day, you can even see Isle of Harris from top of Duncan as well. There's lots of history that's interesting. There was an iron ore mine during the First World War, 1914, that was mined for the war effort. So to turn the iron ore into steel. There is Hallaig, a deserted village on the east side of the island, where Solly MacLean, who's the most renowned Gaelic poet from Scotland, he was born on Raasay, and he wrote a poem called Hallaig. The name Raasay, so Ra in Norse is roe-deer, and say is Gaelic for island. So there are actually very few, if any, roe-deer, but lots of red deer on Raasay to see as well. So certainly, if you then the other benefit, it's only a 25-minute ferry from Skye, so plenty to see on Skye too. So yeah, well, I'm biased, but I would thoroughly recommend coming to see us when you can.
Okay, we have a result of the poll, the voting. Take it in English so you can hear Alistair. Interesting for you as well. So on the first place with 123 votes, it's glass number 7, the cask sample that you sent us.
Very good.
And place number 2 with 49 votes, it's glass number 2, the Chinkapin.
Very interesting.
And on third place is glass number 6 with 47 votes R2.
Great.
And on place number 4, it's a glass number 4. Inaugural release, the first bottling that you send out.
Yeah.
And place number 5, it's both glass number 1 and glass number 3, the rye and the red wine cask, with 28 votes.
Very interesting.
And and seventh place is glass number 5 with 14 votes, R1, R01.
That's fascinating and very helpful for me. Yeah, very, very good.
And what have we paid for all this whiskey?
Anders, innan du tar det, hur många röster sa du att det var på glas 4?
29.
Tack.
We have paid for all this. The glass number 1, the rye cask, we have paid 1,194 Swedish crowns. The Chinkapin whiskey in glass number 2, we have paid 1,195. Glass number 3, the red wine cask, it's 1,182. And glass number 4, the first release, we had to go on the market to buy it, and we have paid 2,200 Swedish crowns for this one to get 2 bottles for this tasting. Also, the glass number 5, R01, we had to buy it in Denmark because of this tasting. We have paid 649 Danish crowns. 649 Danish crowns. And glass number 6, R2, 589 crowns. And so glass number 7, the cask sample, I can't tell you the price that we have paid. So
I can tell you what it's selling in the UK, if that's any help. It would be £85 in the
85
UK.
pounds. Good. So, any more questions from someone? To Alistair or Peter?
What I can share with all of you is that the R01 will arrive to Sweden next year upon when the next batch is ready, which is in September. What I understood from the conversation I had this week with Alistair's colleagues. So R1 will come to Sweden. We just need to be a bit patient here.
Yeah, everything in whiskey takes time.
So a question about those batch R01 and R02. What will they be in the future? Will it be the same sort of age, or will it grow with a mix of young and old?
Yeah, for the next year, next 2 years, they'll be very similar ages. So they'll be by the end of next year, we'll have some more towards 4-year-old, and in 2023 we'll have more towards 4-year-old. But for certainly 2022, 2023, very similar. Hopefully, we think, looking at the stock that we've built up this year for 2024, after 2024, I think we'll be able to use some older stock from 2024 on. But certainly for for the next 2 years, we'll be at a similar age profile. So so in 2007, we started distilling in September 2017. From September 2017 till July 2018, we were working on 1 shift. From 2018, July 2018, all the way through 2019 into 2020, we were on 2 shifts. And then unfortunately with COVID, we had to stop. And then all of this year, we've been on 2 shifts. So that we have some balancing to do with the stocks to start building up some of the older whiskey. So yeah, so I think the next 2 years will be 3-4 years old for sure. And then after that, hopefully from 2024 on, you'll start to see some older whiskey from Raasay.
Thank you.
Någon mera? Någon som har mer frågor? More questions? So, otherwise, we thank you, Alistair, for this tasting, and hope to see you sometimes in the future.
I hope so. It'd be nice to meet in person at some point, definitely. But no, thank you very much, and hopefully that was interesting for everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you.